I never imagined the most expensive bill I would ever send wouldn't come from a restaurant kitchen where I'd spent 10 years sweating over grills and fryers. It would come from the little white farmhouse my grandmother left me after she passed away. And the funny part is, none of it would have happened if a homeowners association hadn't decided charging me $25 every time I visited my own family's property was somehow a reasonable idea. Looking back now, I almost have to laugh, because they thought they were teaching me a lesson. Instead, they accidentally uncovered a mistake that had been buried for nearly 50 years. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 29 years old. I work as a line cook outside Sacramento, and if you've ever worked in a restaurant, you already know the routine. Burned forearms, sore feet, grease stains that somehow survive every wash cycle, and enough exhaustion that your day off feels like it lasts about 30 minutes before Monday shows up again. I wasn't rich, I wasn't connected, and I definitely wasn't the kind of guy people looked at and assumed had lawyers on speed dial. My grandmother, Eleanor Carter, lived in a tiny ranch house tucked inside an upscale neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates. That sounds strange already, doesn't it? Trust me, it looked even stranger in person. Every house surrounding hers looked like it belonged in a luxury real estate magazine. Stone facades, perfectly manicured lawns, expensive SUVs parked in spotless driveways, flower beds that change colors with the seasons because landscapers handled everything. Then there was Grandma's place. Faded white siding, a cracked concrete driveway, an old porch swing that squeaked every time the wind picked up, and a vegetable garden she'd refused to give up even after arthritis made it painful to kneel. She used to joke that tomatoes tasted better when they grew beside peeling paint. I believed her. After she passed away, the house became mine. I didn't move in because my job was almost an hour away, but every Sunday I'd drive over before sunrise, water her garden, trim the weeds, air out the house, and sit on the porch for 15 minutes drinking coffee before heading back home. It became my way of keeping her around. Some people visit cemeteries. I watered tomato plants. For the first couple of weeks, nobody bothered me. A few neighbors waved politely. Others ignored me completely, which honestly suited me just fine. Then on the third Sunday, I pulled into the driveway and immediately noticed something hanging from the front gate. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't tucked under the doormat. It was professionally laminated and zip-tied like it belonged there. Across the top, in gold lettering, were the words Visitor Access Assessment. Underneath that, $25 per vehicle entry. At first I actually smiled because I assumed somebody had mixed me up with a contractor or delivery driver. Then I kept reading. According to the notice, gate cameras had recorded multiple entries over the previous month, and payment was now overdue. $200. Failure to comply would result in additional penalties. I stood there staring at the paper, wondering if this was some kind of joke. Eventually, I called the number listed at the bottom. A woman answered after 2 rings with the kind of cheerful voice people use when they already know they're about to ruin your afternoon. Willow Creek Estates Association. This is Diane Holloway. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I own the house on Birch Lane. I'm not visiting someone. I'm taking care of my property. There was a pause. I heard keyboard clicks. Then her tone changed completely. According to our records, you're not a resident. You're classified as a recurring guest. I actually laughed because it sounded ridiculous. I'm the owner. Ownership and residency aren't the same thing, she replied. Guests are subject to community access fees. Guests, I repeated. My grandmother lived there for 40 years. I'm sorry for your loss, she said without sounding remotely sorry, but policy is policy. I remember leaning against my truck, rubbing my forehead, wondering if this conversation was actually happening. So you're charging me to unlock my own front door? We're charging vehicle access through private community infrastructure. It sounded rehearsed, polished, probably repeated dozens of times before. I thanked her, mostly because I knew staying on the phone wasn't going to accomplish anything, and hung up. But something about that conversation kept bothering me all afternoon. It wasn't even the money. $25 wasn't going to bankrupt me. It was the certainty in her voice, like she believed she had absolute authority over property she'd never owned. That night, instead of watching football like I usually did, I drove back to Grandma's house. The place still smelled faintly of cinnamon and cedar, exactly the way it always had. In the hallway sat an old oak filing cabinet she'd insisted on keeping because paper doesn't crash like computers do. I smiled, remembering how stubborn she was. Inside were insurance papers, faded family photos, tax receipts, and at the very bottom, wrapped inside a yellowed envelope tied with twine, I found something that instantly made my heart beat a little faster. It was the original property deed, dated decades before Willow Creek Estates had ever existed. I didn't know it yet, but that brittle stack of paper was about to turn my $25 parking fee into the biggest financial mistake that HOA had ever made. The next morning, I took the deed to the county recorder's office, mostly because I wanted someone to tell me I was overthinking everything. The woman behind the counter had probably been handling property records longer than I'd been alive. She adjusted her glasses, studied the document for nearly 5 minutes, then looked back at me and asked, "Where exactly is this property?" I gave her the address. She frowned, turned her monitor toward herself, clicked through several maps, then quietly said something that immediately made every hair on my arm stand up. "That's interesting." I hate that word now. Interesting usually means somebody else has just discovered a problem that's about to become yours. She explained that while the subdivision itself had been approved decades earlier, the digital records didn't appear to include any recorded access easement crossing the original Carter parcel. She couldn't give legal advice, but she did suggest hiring a licensed surveyor before talking to anyone else. That sentence probably saved me thousands of dollars. 2 days later, a survey crew rolled into the driveway just after sunrise. 3 men climbed out carrying tripods, bright orange stakes, GPS equipment, and enough technology to launch a satellite. Their supervisor introduced himself as Mark Delaney, a quiet guy in his 60s whose skin looked permanently tanned from spending half his life outdoors. Before they started, I asked him what he expected to find. He smiled politely. "I stopped making predictions 20 years ago. Property lines have a funny way of embarrassing people." They spent almost 6 hours measuring everything. Every corner marker, every elevation point, every retaining wall. I mostly stayed out of their way, bringing bottled water whenever they took breaks, but I couldn't help watching the little orange flags multiply across the neighborhood like breadcrumbs leading somewhere important. Around mid-afternoon, Mark waved me over toward the front entrance of Willow Creek Estates. He pointed at one orange stake driven into the ground beside the decorative brick columns. "This," he said, tapping the survey map, "is your property corner." Then he walked another 100 feet toward the security gate. "And this." He stopped beside the massive wrought iron gate where luxury SUVs waited for residents to scan key cards. "Is also your property." I stared at him, convinced I'd misunderstood. "How much of it?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed me the completed preliminary drawing. The answer was highlighted in fluorescent yellow: the electronic entrance gate. Both brick monument signs, the landscaped median, nearly 200 feet of the only paved entrance road into Willow Creek Estates. Every inch of it sat inside land my family had owned since 1948. My first reaction wasn't excitement. It was confusion. How could an entire neighborhood have been built without anyone noticing something that obvious? Mark answered before I even asked. "Some developers gamble," he said. "Sometimes they expect paperwork to catch up later. Sometimes they assume nobody will ever question it." Then he added the sentence that changed everything. "I couldn't find any recorded easement." I thanked him, drove straight home, spread every document across my kitchen table, and spent the entire evening reading county records until my eyes burned. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. The subdivision developer had gone bankrupt years after construction. Ownership changed hands several times. HOA boards came and went. Management companies rotated every few years. Somewhere in all that chaos, everyone simply assumed the entrance belonged to the association because, well, it had always been there. Nobody ever bothered verifying it. Meanwhile, my grandmother never said a word. Maybe she never knew. Maybe she trusted people too much. Or maybe after Grandpa died, she simply didn't have the energy to fight an entire neighborhood. I kept wondering what she would have done. Then I remembered something she'd once told me while teaching me how to grow tomatoes. "Never start a fight, Ethan. But if someone insists on bringing one to your front porch, make sure they remember whose porch it is." I laughed out loud sitting alone in my apartment. Grandma would have loved this. Instead of calling a lawyer immediately, I decided to try something much simpler. If Willow Creek Estates believed they had the right to charge people for using property they didn't own, maybe it was time they learned how property rights actually worked. I opened my laptop and drafted the most professional invoice I'd ever written. Monthly land lease for commercial entrance infrastructure, $8,500. Electrical service reimbursement based on meter readings, $134 per day. Retroactive utility usage beginning January 1st. Payment due within 15 calendar days. Future modifications to entrance structures subject to written approval by property owner. I even formatted it on clean letterhead and attached copies of the survey report, county records, and photographs showing the electrical connection feeding the gate motor directly from the service panel mounted beside Grandma's garage. Before sealing the envelope, I hesitated for a second. Part of me still expected someone to call and apologize before any of this became real. That phone call never came. Instead, less than 4 hours after the package arrived at the HOA office, my phone rang. Diane Holloway, I answered. She didn't even say hello. She started laughing, not nervous laughter, genuine amusement. Mr. Carter, this is probably the funniest demand letter I've received in years. I leaned back in my chair. Did you finish reading it? Oh, every page. She chuckled again. You honestly expect the association to pay you $8,500 a month? Actually, I corrected her. That's before utilities. Her laughter stopped for a moment before returning even louder. Our attorney is going to enjoy this. Great, I replied. Have your attorney read page 7 carefully? That's where the survey references the county monument coordinates. Silence. Real silence this time. I heard paper moving, a keyboard clicking. She came back 30 seconds later sounding noticeably less confident. Hold, please. Another voice joined the call a minute later. A man introduced himself as the association's legal counsel. Unlike Diane, he didn't joke. He asked 3 questions. Where had I obtained the survey? Was it certified? Could I email the supporting documents directly? I sent everything while we were still on the phone. Then, nothing. 30 seconds passed. Then, another minute. Finally, he cleared his throat. We'll need time to review these materials. Take all the time you need, I answered. The invoice isn't due for another 2 weeks. We hung up. The following morning, I drove over to check on the house like always. The gate kept opening and closing. Residents drove through without the slightest clue that every movement depended on electricity flowing through a meter registered in my name. I stood beside Grandma's herb garden, listening to the soft mechanical hum of the gate motor in the distance. Every time it cycled open, I mentally added another few cents to the unpaid electricity bill. It almost became funny. Around lunchtime, my next-door neighbor, an elderly widower named Frank, wandered over carrying a cup of coffee. He'd lived there longer than almost anyone else. Word travels fast, he said with a grin. Board meeting was loud last night. That's so? Half of them think you're bluffing. The other half spent 3 hours asking why nobody ever checked the property records. I smiled. Which side are you on? Frank laughed into his coffee. Son, I've lived long enough to know land records don't care about opinions. 3 days passed. No payment, no settlement, no apology. Every morning the gate continued drawing electricity from my panel as though nothing had changed. Every evening I updated the invoice with another day's utility charges. By the 4th morning, I'd made my decision. I walked to the breaker box mounted on the outside wall, unlocked the metal cover, rested my hand on the switch feeding the entrance circuit, and just stood there for a few seconds. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I simply wasn't willing to keep providing something that nobody believed belonged to me. I thought about Grandma again. About every Sunday she'd spent quietly tending flowers while luxury cars rolled across land carrying her family's name. Then I took a slow breath, flipped the breaker down, clicked a heavy padlock through the panel latch, and listened as the distant humming sound disappeared into complete silence. The neighborhood had no idea that within the next 10 minutes, everything they believed about power, ownership, and control was about to change forever. It took less than 10 minutes. That was all it took for months of arrogance to collide with one little breaker switch mounted on the side of my grandmother's garage. I was sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee when I heard the first horn, then another, then what sounded like half the neighborhood leaning on their steering wheels at once. I walked toward the entrance slowly, not because I wanted to enjoy the moment, but because I honestly wanted to make sure nothing dangerous had happened. The security gate had stopped halfway open. Cars stretched down both sides of the road, and delivery truck couldn't get through. Parents were trying to turn around after dropping kids at school, and residents were arguing with each other like somehow the gate itself had personally offended them. About 15 minutes later, a black luxury SUV came flying around the corner so fast it nearly jumped the curb. Diane Holloway climbed out before the vehicle had fully stopped, followed by 2 board members who looked equally furious. She marched across the grass until she was standing in front of me. "Did you shut off our gate?" she demanded. I looked at her calmly. Your gate? Her jaw tightened. Turn the power back on immediately. I'd be happy to discuss restoring electrical service, I replied, once the outstanding balance is addressed. She stared at me as if I had spoken another language. You cannot hold an entire community hostage. I couldn't help smiling a little. Interesting choice of words. I seem to remember being told that policy was policy. One of the board members stepped forward. We're calling the sheriff. I shrugged. Please do. Maybe they'll enjoy looking at the survey too? Diane's confidence slipped for the first time. She had expected an argument, maybe even a shouting match. Instead, I handed her a fresh envelope. Inside was an updated invoice. The monthly lease had increased to reflect continued unauthorized occupation. The unpaid electricity charges had grown, and attached to the last page was a proposed 10-year access agreement that would legally protect both of us moving forward. She flipped through the pages, stopped at the total, and looked back at me with a mixture of disbelief and anger. This is extortion. No, I answered quietly. Extortion would have been threatening to take something that belonged to you. I'm asking to be paid for something that's already mine. Nobody said another word. They left, tires spinning as they pulled away, but the power stayed off. By that evening, residents had started asking questions the board couldn't answer. Why had the entrance failed? Why was the HOA suddenly meeting behind closed doors? Why were attorneys coming and going from the clubhouse? 3 days later, my phone rang again. This time it was the association's attorney, and his tone was completely different from our first conversation. Mr. Carter, he began, my clients would like to discuss a settlement. I almost laughed because just a week earlier they thought I was bluffing. We met in a conference room downtown. For nearly 2 hours, we reviewed maps, historical deeds, utility records, and engineering plans. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody laughed anymore. Eventually, the attorney leaned back in his chair and admitted what everyone already knew. The association had inherited a problem that should have been solved decades earlier. But legally, the documents were on my side. They agreed to lease the land instead of risking years of litigation and the possibility of losing access to the neighborhood entirely. I had only one additional condition. The attorney looked puzzled. Just one? I nodded. Install a bronze plaque beside the entrance. A plaque? Yes. I slid a typed sentence across the table. This entrance stands on land preserved by the Carter family ranch, established in 1948. She looked at me for several seconds before quietly asking, "That's all you want?" I smiled. Money comes and goes. History shouldn't. A month later, the agreement was signed. The HOA began sending monthly lease payments. Every future modification to the entrance required my written approval, and utility service was transferred under a formal contract instead of assumptions and handshakes. The bronze plaque was installed exactly where I'd requested. Every Sunday now, I still drive out to the little ranch house. I water Grandma's tomatoes, trim the herbs she planted years ago, sit on the old porch swing with my coffee, and sometimes watch residents slow down just enough to read that plaque before driving through the gate. Most never know the entire story. They just know the entrance belongs there because that's how it's always been. But I know better. Sometimes the biggest victories don't come from revenge. They come from refusing to let people rewrite history simply because they have nicer cars, bigger houses, or louder opinions. If Diane and the board had treated me with a little respect, instead of trying to collect $25 from the grandson of the woman who quietly lived there for decades, none of this would have happened. One small act of arrogance uncovered a mistake that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly half a century. And honestly, that's the part I still think about the most. So now I want to hear from you. Who do you think was really in the wrong here? Should the HOA have been forced to pay for using land they never legally owned? Or should Ethan have simply let it go for the sake of the neighborhood? If you've ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or someone abusing a little bit of authority, share your story in the comments. I read as many of them as I can, and some of the craziest ones end up inspiring future videos. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.